Dawn breaks over the Kentish countryside, southeast England. Mist clings to still water. Stone towers rise from an artificial island, their reflection perfect in the moat below. This is Leeds Castle, not in Yorkshire where you'd expect, but in Kent, and it has nothing to do with the city of Leeds at all. 900 years of royal ownership. 6 wives of one king walked these halls, a fortress that became a prison, then a palace, then a problem. And in 1974, something happened that split opinion down the middle. A sale so controversial, it's still debated today. Was it salvation or betrayal? Private rescue or public theft? If you enjoy deep investigations into English castles and the families who shaped them, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, should historic castles ever be sold to private buyers, or do they belong to the nation? Your support makes these detailed stories possible. Let's begin. The name is a lie. Leeds Castle has nothing to do with Leeds in Yorkshire. The name comes from Leeds, a Saxon chief who held the manor in the 9th century. The Domesday Book of 1086 records the manor as Leeds, owned by the Bishop of Bayeux, half-brother to William the Conqueror. By 1119, the Normans had turned his wooden fort into stone. Robert de Crèvecoeur raised the first towers on 2 islands in the River Lenne, creating a castle that could only be reached by boat or drawbridge. Water became its first defense. The geography was deliberate. The River Lenne had been dammed to create an artificial lake, flooding the valley and isolating the islands completely. Any attacker would have to cross open water under fire from the walls. There were no blind spots, no cover, no way to bring siege engines close. For the 12th century, this was cutting-edge military architecture. But castles are expensive. Stone had to be quarried and hauled. Skilled masons commanded high wages. Labor came from the surrounding villages. Men pulled from farms and workshops to spend months cutting, lifting, and mortaring. We don't know their names. We know only that the castle rose slowly, year by year, a monument to Norman power built by English hands. By 1139, the castle had passed to the Crèvecoeur family, who held it through the civil war between Stephen and Matilda. Then came the kings. In 1278, Edward I purchased Leeds Castle for his beloved wife, Eleanor of Castile. The sale price was recorded in the royal accounts as £4,000, equivalent to roughly £3 million today. But Edward didn't just buy the castle, he transformed it. Over the next decade, he spent an additional £6,000, equal to another £4.5 million, converting the fortress into a royal residence fit for a queen. The Gloriette was his masterpiece, a D-shaped structure built on the smaller of the 2 islands. It became Eleanor's private apartments. Stone walls rose 60 feet directly from the water. The ground floor held service rooms, kitchens, pantries, storage. The first floor was the Great Hall, with a soaring timber roof and tall windows facing south to catch the light. The second floor contained the Queen's chambers, private rooms where she could retreat from court, from politics, from the eyes of advisors and courtiers who watched her every move. The construction records survive in fragments: orders for calm stone from Normandy, contracts with glaziers to install leaded glass, still a luxury reserved for royal buildings and cathedrals, payments to painters who decorated the walls with geometric patterns in red, blue, and gold, shipments of timber from the royal forests, oak beams 40 feet long to span the Great Hall without interior supports. Eleanor died in 1290. Edward, grief-stricken, ordered memorial crosses erected at every place her funeral cortege stopped on its journey from Nottinghamshire to Westminster Abbey. 12 crosses, the last at Charing Cross in London. Leeds Castle was not on that route, but Eleanor had loved it, and Edward ensured it remained a royal residence, a monument to her memory carved in stone and water. For the next 300 years, Leeds Castle remained crown property. It passed from monarch to monarch, each adding their own touches. Edward II gave it to his wife, Isabella of France, in 1318. She used it as a refuge, and later as a base, during her rebellion against her husband. The castle where she had lived as queen became the fortress from which she plotted to overthrow him. In 1321, Margaret de Clare, wife of Bartholomew de Badlesmere, made a fatal mistake. Edward II approached Leeds Castle with a small retinue, expecting to stay the night. Margaret, loyal to the rebellious barons, refused him entry. The king was humiliated, turned away from a royal castle by a subject's wife. His revenge was swift. He laid siege to Leeds with a full army. Margaret surrendered after 5 days. Her husband was executed. Margaret was imprisoned. The message was clear. Leeds belonged to the crown, and defying royal authority, there was treason. Richard II gave Leeds to his wife, Anne of Bohemia, in 1382. She spent her summers there, hosting tournaments and feasts. When she died of plague in 1394, Richard was so devastated, he ordered the manor where she died to be demolished. Perhaps its beauty was comfort, or perhaps destroying it would have felt like erasing her completely. Henry VIII granted Leeds to his second wife, Joan of Navarre, in 1403. She was unpopular, a foreign queen suspected of witchcraft. In 1419, she was arrested on charges of attempting to kill the king through sorcery. The evidence was thin, likely fabricated by political enemies seeking to seize her considerable dower lands. Joan was imprisoned at Leeds Castle for 3 years, a prisoner in the same rooms where she had once ruled as queen. She was released in 1422. Charges quietly dropped, but her reputation never recovered. Leeds Castle had become a prison as well as a palace. Catherine de Valois, Henry VIII's widow, was granted Leeds in 1422. She preferred it to other royal residences, perhaps because its isolation offered freedom. Court records suggest she brought her secret lover, Owen Tudor, to Leeds. Their relationship was scandalous, a queen consorting with a Welsh squire. But the castle's moat and distance from London gave them privacy. Their children, born at Leeds or elsewhere, founded the Tudor dynasty. One grandson became Henry VII. Another became the ancestor of Elizabeth I. 6 queens had called Leeds home. Each left something behind: a chapel, a garden, a painted ceiling. But the castle's most famous resident was yet to come. Henry VIII received Leeds Castle in 1519 as part of his inheritance when his father's estate was finally settled. He was 28 years old, athletic, charming, still married to Catherine of Aragon, and years away from the marital chaos that would define his reign. He spent lavishly on renovations, exact figures lost in incomplete records, but surviving accounts show shipments of oak paneling from royal forests, Flemish tapestries purchased in Antwerp, and Italian marble imported at staggering cost. Henry converted the medieval fortress into a Tudor palace. The Gloriette, still largely as Edward I had built it, received new windows, fireplaces, and interior decoration. The main castle on the larger island was expanded with a new banqueting hall, privy chambers, and a gallery for displaying armor and weapons. The tilting yard was redesigned for tournaments. The gardens were replanted with fashionable Italian-style parterres, geometric beds filled with herbs and flowers imported from across Europe. Catherine of Aragon visited Leeds several times between 1519 and 1525. She walked the same galleries Eleanor of Castile had walked, prayed in the same chapel where Joan of Navarre had prayed during her imprisonment. The continuity was deliberate. Henry was linking himself to his royal predecessors, proving his legitimacy through architecture and ritual. Then came Anne Boleyn, Henry brought her to Leeds in 1533, shortly before their secret marriage was made public. By then, he had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, all to annul his marriage to Catherine and wed Anne. The political fallout was catastrophic. Half of Europe condemned him. Riots broke out in England. Catherine's supporters, numerous and vocal, saw Anne as an upstart, a homewrecker, the cause of England's rupture with Catholicism. Leeds Castle became a refuge, away from London, away from hostile crowds and disapproving courtiers. Henry and Anne could play at being king and queen without interruption. They hunted in the parkland, dined in the banqueting hall, walked the gardens at dusk. Staff prepared the same rooms Catherine had used, the same bed, the same chairs. Some said Anne was uncomfortable there, haunted not by ghosts, but by guilt. 3 years later, Anne was dead, arrested on May 2nd, 1536, on charges of adultery with 5 men, including her own brother, treason, incest, witchcraft. The charges were almost certainly fabricated, a political assassination orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell and approved by a king desperate for a male heir and already infatuated with Jane Seymour. Anne was tried, convicted, and executed at the Tower of London on May 19, 1536. She was 29 years old. Her ghost, according to local legend, returned to Leeds. Staff reported seeing a woman in Tudor dress, walking the Gloriette at night, her face pale, her expression mournful, her hands clasped as if in prayer. Doors opened on their own. Footsteps echoed in empty corridors. A cold draft would sweep through rooms, even when all windows were closed. The stories persisted for centuries. In the 1800s, a housemaid quit her position, claiming she had seen Anne Boleyn standing at a window in the Queen's chamber, staring out at the water. In the 1930s, a night watchman refused to work alone after hearing a woman sobbing in the same room, a room that had been locked and empty for hours. Visitors in the 1950s reported sudden drops in temperature in the Gloriette, feelings of overwhelming sadness, and the sensation of being watched. Was Anne Boleyn's spirit genuinely trapped at Leeds? Or did centuries of violent history, executions, imprisonments, betrayals, soak into the stone until the castle itself seemed haunted by its past? Skeptics pointed to the power of suggestion, the way stories shape perception, how people see what they expect to see. Believers countered that too many witnesses, across too many centuries, had reported identical experiences in the same locations. The records show only this. After Anne's death, Henry visited Leeds less frequently. He gave it to his 6th wife, Catherine Parr, as part of her jointure in 1543. She survived him, but she spent little time there. The castle's golden age as a royal residence was ending. The Tudor court preferred Greenwich, Hampton Court, and Whitehall. Leeds, remote and old-fashioned, fell out of favor. In 1552, 5 years after Henry's death, his son Edward VI did something unprecedented. He gave Leeds Castle away, not to another monarch, not to the church, but to a courtier, Sir Anthony St. Leger, a loyal servant who had governed Ireland for the crown. The grant was recorded in the calendar of patent rolls. Leeds Castle and its estates, approximately 1,200 acres, transferred in perpetuity in recognition of faithful service. This was the first privatization. For over 300 years, Leeds had been crown property, paid for by taxpayers, maintained from royal revenues, a symbol of royal power. Now it belonged to one man. The decision was pragmatic. Edward's government was broke. The war with France had drained the treasury. Selling or granting royal properties generated immediate income or eliminated maintenance costs. Dozens of castles and manors were transferred to private hands during Edward's brief reign. Leeds was simply one among many. St. Leger didn't want a fortress. He wanted a country house. He filled in some of the defensive ditches, making the castle easier to reach by carriage. He softened the military architecture, removing crenellations and replacing arrow slits with larger windows. He installed more comfortable furnishings, converting guard rooms into parlors and bedrooms. Leeds was being civilized, domesticated. The change was irreversible. St. Leger died in 1559. Leeds passed to his son, another Anthony, then to his grandson. By the early 1600s, the family was in financial trouble. Land sales, bad harvests, and mounting debts forced them to sell. In 1632, Leeds Castle was purchased by Sir Richard Smythe, a wealthy London merchant who had made a fortune in trade with the Levant. Smythe's purchase was a statement. Merchants were rising. Land, once the exclusive domain of aristocrats, could now be bought by anyone with money. The social order was shifting, and Leeds Castle, built for kings, now belonged to a tradesman's family. The Smythes held Leeds through the English Civil War, 1642 to 1651. Kent was contested territory, sometimes royalist, sometimes parliamentary. Leeds Castle changed hands twice, occupied first by parliamentary forces, then briefly by royalists, then retaken. The interior suffered. Furniture was looted, tapestries torn. Soldiers carved their names into wooden panels, graffiti that can still be seen today in the gatehouse. After the war, the Smiths restored what they could, but the damage was deeper than broken furniture. The castle's aura of impregnability was shattered. It had been captured, occupied, vandalized. It was no longer a symbol of unassailable power. It was just a building. In 1665, Leeds passed by marriage to the Culpeper family. They held it for 150 years, maintaining it as a country seat, hosting hunting parties and local gentry, but adding little. The Gloriette began to decay. Roofs leaked, stone crumbled, ivy climbed the walls, picturesque but destructive, roots prying apart mortar and widening cracks. By the early 1800s, Leeds Castle was in serious decline. The Culpers, like so many landed families, were struggling. Agricultural prices had collapsed after the Napoleonic Wars. Inheritance taxes were rising. Estate income couldn't cover maintenance. Parts of the castle were abandoned, left to reign and rot. In 1823, Leeds Castle was sold again, this time to Fiennes Wycombe Martin, a wealthy landowner from Devon. He saw potential. The Romantic movement was in full swing. Byron and Shelley were writing about ruined castles. Artists were painting crumbling medieval towers against stormy skies. Picturesque decay was fashionable. Wycombe Martin decided to embrace it. He hired architects to stabilize the structure, just enough to prevent collapse, but he deliberately left some ruins intact for aesthetic effect. He landscaped the grounds in the naturalistic English style, replacing formal Tudor gardens with sweeping lawns, irregular tree plantings, and carefully staged views. He opened the castle to genteel visitors, charging a small fee. Leeds became an early example of heritage tourism, a historic site preserved not for use, but for display. The Wycombe Martin family held Leeds Castle for over a century, but their grip weakened with each generation. Death duties, introduced in the late 1800s, struck hard. Each time the estate passed from father to son, the government claimed a percentage. By the early 1900s, the family was borrowing against the estate just to pay the taxes. The First World War made everything worse. Agricultural labor vanished. Prices collapsed again. Maintenance was deferred, then abandoned. By the 1920s, Leeds Castle was in crisis. Then, in 1926, an outsider arrived, an American, a woman, and she would change everything. Her name was Olive, Lady Bailey. Born Olive Cecilia Paget in 1899, she was the daughter of Almeric Paget, 1st Baron Queenborough, and Pauline Whitney, daughter of one of America's wealthiest men. William C. Whitney had been Secretary of the Navy under President Grover Cleveland, but his real fortune came from finance, transportation, and the ruthless consolidation of New York streetcar companies. He was worth an estimated $23 million when he died in 1904, roughly $700 million today. Olive's mother, Pauline, inherited a substantial portion of that fortune. She married Almeric Paget, a British aristocrat, in 1895, partly for love, partly for a title. Pauline became Lady Queenborough. Olive grew up between two worlds, American money and British aristocracy, never quite fitting into either. Pauline died in 1916. Olive inherited approximately $3 million, equivalent to $50 million today. She was 17 years old. The inheritance was held in trust until she turned 21, managed by New York bankers who invested conservatively and watched the fortune grow. By 1926, when Olive gained full control, her wealth had increased to roughly £800,000, about £50 million in modern terms. Money on that scale bought choices. Olive could have lived in London, Paris, or New York. She could have funded hospitals, universities, museums. She could have done nothing, lived on the interest, and never worked a day in her life. She chose something far more complicated. She bought Leeds Castle. The sale negotiations began in early 1926. The Wycombe Martins were desperate. Inheritance taxes were due. The estate was losing money every month. They needed a buyer, and they needed one fast. Olive, recently divorced from her first husband and looking for a project, a purpose, something to define her life, saw an opportunity. The sale price is disputed in surviving records. Some sources say £180,000. Others claim £250,000. What is clear is that Olive paid cash, no mortgage, no financing, and she bought not just the castle, but the entire estate, 500 acres of parkland, formal gardens, tenant farms, cottages, woodland, lakes, and the village itself. She became, overnight, Lady of the Manor. The Wycombe Martins were relieved. They walked away solvent, the crushing debt lifted, free to live modestly on what remained. The estate was saved, or so they thought, but not everyone was pleased. Local historians protested. Letters appeared in newspapers, asking why an American heiress should own a castle that had once belonged to English kings and queens. The Daily Mail ran a column titled, "Our Heritage Sold to Yankees," decrying the loss of national treasures to foreign buyers. Questions were raised in Parliament. Why wasn't the National Trust stepping in? Why wasn't the government preserving this for the nation? The answer was simple and brutal. There was no money. Britain in the 1920s was still reeling from World War I. National debt was crushing. Unemployment was high. The National Trust, founded in 1895 to preserve places of historic interest and natural beauty, was chronically underfunded, surviving on donations and small bequests. The government had no system for acquiring and maintaining historic buildings. The Ministry of Works managed a handful of ancient monuments, but Leeds didn't qualify. It was inhabited, privately owned, and too expensive. Private wealth was the only option. Olive ignored the criticism. She had plans, she had vision, and she had vision, and she had money. What Olive did to Leeds Castle between 1926 and her death in 1974 was extraordinary, controversial, and impossible to separate from her own complicated personality. She was driven, perfectionist, demanding, generous, cold, and utterly obsessed with beauty. She hired Armand Albert Rateau, a French architect known for his work on luxury apartments in Paris, and Stéphane Boudin of Maison Janssen, the most prestigious interior design firm in the world. Together, they set about transforming Leeds Castle into Olive's vision of perfection. The first step was structural. The castle had deteriorated badly. Roofs were failing. Walls were unstable. The gloriette, unoccupied for decades, was close to collapse. Olive hired engineers to assess the damage. Their report was grim. Extensive rebuilding was required, particularly in the gloriette, where medieval foundations were sinking into the soft island soil. The solution was expensive and invasive. The gloriette was partially dismantled, stone by stone. Each stone was numbered, photographed, and stored. New concrete foundations were poured, sunk deep into bedrock beneath the island. Steel reinforcements were threaded through the walls, hidden inside the medieval masonry. Then the building was reassembled, stone by stone, a 14th century structure rebuilt with 20th century engineering. Critics called it vandalism. Preservationists argued that replacing foundations destroyed the building's authenticity, that Leeds Castle was now a replica, not an original. Olive countered that without the work, the gloriette would have collapsed within a decade. Better a rebuilt medieval structure than a pile of stones in a lake. The work took 4 years, 1926 to 1930. During that time, Olive lived partly at Leeds, supervising every detail, and partly in London and Paris, sourcing furniture, art, and decorative objects. She had a vision. Leeds Castle should look as if it had been continuously inhabited by people of impeccable taste for 900 years. Every room should tell a story. Every object should be museum quality. She bought French furniture from the 17th and 18th centuries, pieces that had belonged to aristocrats before the Revolution. She acquired Impressionist paintings, works by Monet, Renoir, and Pissarro, bought at auction houses in Paris and London. She collected Chinese porcelain, Persian rugs, Flemish tapestries, Italian sculptures. The castle became a repository of European art and craft, assembled by one woman's eye and bottomless wallet. But Olive also made controversial decisions. She removed Victorian additions, ripping out fireplaces, paneling, and plasterwork installed by the Wycombe Martins in the 1800s. She exposed medieval stone, even where it had been deliberately covered for aesthetic reasons. She installed modern plumbing, central heating, and electricity, luxuries the Wycombe Martins had never afforded. But she did so in ways that altered original structures. Bathrooms were carved out of medieval chambers. Radiators were installed behind carved screens. Electric wiring snaked through 700-year-old walls. Critics said she was turning a medieval English castle into a French chateau, imposing foreign taste on English heritage. Supporters said she was saving it from collapse, that without her money and vision, Leeds Castle would have been demolished or left to ruin, like hundreds of other British castles in the 20th century. The truth, as always, was more complicated. Olive was both savior and vandal, preservationist and revisionist. She saved Leeds Castle, but she also shaped it into something it had never been, a fantasy of aristocratic perfection, historically inspired, but not historically accurate, beautiful, but not authentic. The cost was staggering. Between 1926 and 1940, Olive spent an estimated £500,000 on Leeds Castle, roughly £30 million today. That covered the structural work, the interior design, the art and furniture, but also the annual operating costs. She employed 40 to 50 full-time staff. Gardeners maintained 25 acres of formal gardens, designed by Russell Page, one of the 20th century's most famous landscape architects. Housekeepers polished parquet floors, cleaned windows, waxed furniture, Cooks prepared elaborate meals for Olive and her guests. Chauffeurs, valets, ladies' maids, footmen, all on Olive's payroll. The gardens alone consumed a small fortune. Page's design, installed between 1930 and 1933, replaced the naturalistic Victorian landscape with formal terraces, box parterres, and a maze. Thousands of plants were imported: roses from France, tulips from Holland, exotic shrubs from Asia. The work required 12 full-time gardeners and seasonal laborers for planting and maintenance. Olive turned Leeds Castle into a stage for the international elite. She hosted weekend parties that rivaled anything at Blenheim or Chatsworth. Guests arrived by train from London, met at the station by Olive's chauffeurs, driven to the castle in Rolls-Royces and Bentleys. The approach, carefully choreographed, revealed the castle gradually, glimpses through trees, then the full facade reflected in the moat. Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson visited before his abdication in 1936. Olive, American and divorced, was one of the few British society figures who welcomed Wallis openly. Errol Flynn came for shooting parties. Douglas Fairbanks Jr. and Charlie Chaplin attended dinners. Winston Churchill was a regular guest, using Leeds as a retreat from Westminster, a place where he could think and write without constant interruption. Olive's guest lists were strategic. She cultivated politicians, diplomats, financiers, anyone with power or influence. She created an environment where deals could be discussed informally, where alliances could be formed over dinner and whiskey, where the line between social and political blurred. Leeds Castle became a place where things happened, where decisions were made, where the powerful gathered away from public scrutiny. But behind the glamour, the servants saw a different Olive. Some described a demanding but fair employer who paid better than most estates, offered job security, and treated staff with basic respect. Others painted a harsher picture: a woman obsessed with control, who fired staff for minor infractions, who inspected rooms with white gloves, who demanded silence in her presence unless spoken to. One former maid, interviewed in the 1980s, recalled being dismissed for speaking to a guest without permission. Another, a footman, described a household ruled by rigid protocol, where servants were expected to be invisible, where any visible mistake meant dismissal without reference, a career-ending punishment. A gardener remembered Olive walking the grounds every morning, pointing out weeds, demanding instant removal, never a word of thanks or acknowledgement. The village had mixed feelings. Olive's money brought jobs and stability. Tenant farmers paid rent to the estate, but Olive kept rents low and maintained cottages. The village school received donations. The church got a new roof. Olive, despite being American and largely absent from village life, was seen as a benefactor, even if a distant one. But she was also an outsider. Divorced twice, childless and unapologetically wealthy, in a country still scarred by war and rationing. Olive didn't fit. She didn't attend the local church regularly. She rarely mingled with villagers. She existed behind the moat, literally and figuratively, a figure of wealth and power who shaped the village's economy, but remained separate from its community. Then came September 1939. Britain declared war on Germany. Europe plunged into chaos, and Leeds Castle, like everything else, changed. Olive, despite her wealth and American passport, stayed at Leeds. She was 40 years old, twice divorced, with no children and no immediate family in Britain. She could have returned to New York, sat out the war in safety. She chose to stay. The castle changed overnight. Blackout curtains went up on every window. Tape was stretched across glass panes in X patterns to reduce shattering from bomb blasts. Olive offered parts of the estate to the military. The RAF used the parkland for training exercises, soldiers drilling on lawns where garden parties had been held months earlier. The Home Guard, made up of men too old or unfit for active service, used the outbuildings for storage and training. But Olive kept the main castle for herself. She continued hosting guests, now military officers, intelligence operatives, politicians planning the war effort. The glittering pre-war parties were replaced by quieter, more serious gatherings. Dinner conversations focused on strategy, logistics, intelligence reports. Leeds became, quietly, a place where sensitive conversations happened away from London's scrutiny and potential bombing. There are gaps in the records from this period. Documents that should exist, guest lists, menus, staff logs, correspondence, are missing. The estate archives, usually meticulous, have unexplained holes between 1939 and 1945. Some historians suspect Olive was asked or agreed to remove or destroy records for security reasons. There are hints, however. A 1943 letter from a government official, discovered in the National Archives in the 1990s, thanks Olive for her hospitality and discretion. A War Office memo from 1944 mentions Leeds Castle as a suitable location for discreet meetings. A former intelligence officer, writing his memoirs in the 1970s, describes staying at a castle in Kent, which he doesn't name, where Allied officers met to coordinate plans. The description matches Leeds. What was happening there? Historians have speculated, but without documentation, we can only guess. Was Leeds Castle used for intelligence briefings? Did code breakers visit? Were captured German officers interrogated there? Did Allied planners use it as a secure location to coordinate operations? Olive never spoke publicly about what happened at Leeds Castle during the war. Staff who worked there between 1939 and 1945 were reportedly asked to sign confidentiality agreements, unusual for domestic servants. When journalists asked Olive about the war years, she deflected, talking instead about the difficulty of maintaining the castle with reduced staff and rationing. What we know for certain is this: the castle survived the war physically intact. No bombs fell on Leeds. No damage was inflicted. The gardens, neglected but not destroyed, could be restored. The house, its contents, the art collections, all emerged unscathed. But something had changed. The world Olive had known, the world of country house parties and international elites moving freely across Europe, was gone. After the war, Olive reopened Leeds Castle to carefully selected guests. She resumed entertaining, but the scale was smaller, the atmosphere more subdued. The pre-war glitter never fully returned. Britain was broke, exhausted, rebuilding. Rationing continued until 1954. The aristocracy, already declining, faced crushing inheritance taxes. Country houses across Britain were being demolished, dozens every year, torn down because owners couldn't afford maintenance, and the government offered no help. Olive watched this happening and began to think seriously about Leeds Castle's future. She was in her 50s, healthy but aware that time was finite. She had no children. Her closest relatives were American cousins who had never seen Leeds Castle and had no interest in moving to England to manage a medieval castle and 500-acre estate. She could sell it, but to whom? Developers would tear it apart, turning the castle into luxury flats or a hotel, gutting the interiors, destroying everything she had created. Private buyers would face the same problems she had solved with her fortune: astronomical maintenance costs, endless repairs, staff to manage, gardens to maintain. Without significant wealth, Leeds Castle would decay. She could give it to the National Trust. This was the expected solution, the right thing to do. The trust had been accepting historic properties since its founding in 1895, preserving them for public access, funded by endowments, membership fees, and government grants. Dozens of aristocratic families had donated their estates to the trust, unable to maintain them privately, grateful for a solution that preserved their family homes for posterity. But Olive didn't trust the National Trust. She had seen how they operated. They stripped houses of personal collections, sold off furniture and art to fund maintenance, and replaced unique interiors with generic antiques. They turned living homes into sanitized museums, safe and educational but soulless. Olive had spent decades assembling Leeds Castle's collections, sourcing every piece personally, arranging every room to her exacting standards. She wanted Leeds to remain a living space, beautiful, personal, functional, not a museum where her taste was edited out and replaced by committee decisions. So Olive began exploring another option, a private foundation. She consulted lawyers, accountants, and tax specialists. The idea was radical for its time. She would create a charitable trust, endow it with her fortune, and give it a single mandate: preserve Leeds Castle forever, as she had shaped it, open it to the public, generate revenue through admissions and events, but never let the government or national trust control it. The legal work took years. Trusts were complicated. Charity law was unclear. The tax implications were intricate. Olive was determined to get it right. She wanted absolute certainty that Leeds Castle would be protected after her death, that her vision would endure, that the castle would never be sold, divided, or destroyed. By the early 1970s, Olive was seriously ill. She had smoked heavily all her life, and lung cancer was diagnosed in 1972. She knew she had limited time. She accelerated the foundation work, meeting with lawyers weekly, revising documents, ensuring every detail was ironclad. The Leeds Castle Foundation was formally established in 1974. Olive transferred ownership of the castle, the estate, and a substantial endowment, exact amount unknown but estimated at several £1,000,000, to the foundation. She appointed trustees, a mix of friends, lawyers, and heritage experts, and gave them detailed instructions. Preserve the castle and its collections as a unified whole. Open it to the public at least 300 days per year. Generate revenue to fund maintenance. Never sell the core collections, and never allow the castle to be divided or repurposed. Olive died on September 11, 1974, at Leeds Castle. She was 75 years old. Her funeral was held in the castle chapel. Her ashes were scattered in the moat she had loved, the castle she had saved, shaped, and controlled for 48 years now, belonged to an institution she had created, a foundation designed to outlive her and protect her legacy forever. Her will was made public, and Britain erupted in debate. The arguments started immediately. Critics called Olive's decision arrogant and undemocratic. Leeds Castle had been royal property for 300 years. It had been built by English kings, paid for by taxpayers' ancestors. It had survived wars, revolutions, and economic collapse. It was part of Britain's national heritage. Now, one wealthy American had locked it away in a private trust that would control it forever, beyond democratic oversight, beyond public accountability. Labour MPs in Parliament demanded the government intervene. They argued that castles of national importance should not be left to the whims of private foundations. What if the foundation mismanaged it? What if future trustees sold off the art? What if they turned it into a corporate event venue, gutting its historic character for profit? The Leeds Castle Foundation responded calmly and firmly. They published Olive's will, showing the restrictions she had imposed. The castle would be open to the public 330 days a year. Admission fees would fund maintenance, not profits. The core collections would remain intact, never sold, never divided. The trustees were legally bound to preserve the castle as Olive had left it. Any violation would trigger legal action and potentially dissolve the trust, reverting control to the High Court. But the deeper question remained: should private individuals be allowed to control national heritage? Supporters said yes, absolutely. Olive had saved Leeds Castle when no one else would or could. In 1926, the government had no interest in acquiring it. The National Trust lacked funds. The Wycombe Martins were desperate. If Olive hadn't bought it, Leeds Castle would likely have been demolished, like hundreds of other country houses in the 20th century. She had spent her fortune, her life, preserving it. Why shouldn't she decide its future? Critics said no. Heritage belongs to everyone. A medieval castle built by kings, shaped by queens, soaked in English history, should be publicly owned. Private foundations, no matter how well-intentioned, are unaccountable. Trustees can be fired or replaced. Policies can change. Olive's vision might be benevolent, but future trustees might not share her values. Public ownership, through the National Trust or English Heritage, would guarantee democratic accountability, transparency, and permanence. The debate played out in newspapers, on radio, in Parliament. The Times ran editorials on both sides. The Guardian called Olive's foundation a dangerous precedent. The Telegraph praised her foresight and generosity. Heritage groups were divided. The Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings supported Olive's decision, arguing that private preservation had saved Leeds where public institutions had failed. The Ancient Monuments Society condemned it, insisting that national treasures should never be privately controlled. The government stayed neutral. Leeds Castle was privately owned, transferred legally to a registered charity. There were no grounds for intervention. If Parliament wanted to change the law to restrict private ownership of historic buildings, they could legislate, but such a law would be politically toxic, seen as confiscation, attacking property rights, punishing the wealthy for preserving heritage. No government wanted that fight. The controversy slowly faded. The foundation operated quietly, professionally, proving it could manage the castle responsibly. But the underlying tension never disappeared. Was Leeds Castle saved or stolen? Preserved for the nation or locked away from it? Today, Leeds Castle is one of the most visited historic properties in England. Over 500,000 people visit annually, down slightly from a peak of 600,000 in the 1990s, but still substantial. Admission is £30 to £35 for adults. Expensive, but comparable to other major heritage sites like Blenheim Palace, Warwick Castle, or Hampton Court. The Leeds Castle Foundation operates it exactly as Olive intended. The interiors remain largely as she left them. French furniture, Impressionist paintings, Chinese porcelain, Persian rugs, all in the same rooms where Olive placed them. The gardens are immaculate, maintained by a team of 20 gardeners, the same design Russell Page created in the 1930s. The castle is open 330 days a year, closing only for Christmas and essential maintenance. But Leeds Castle is also a business. The foundation generates revenue through multiple streams: admissions, events, corporate hires, retail, food service. The castle hosts 150 to 200 weddings per year, couples marrying in the chapel or on the terraces, receptions and marquees on the lawn. Corporate clients hire the castle for conferences, team-building exercises, product launches, classical concerts, food festivals, and historical reenactments draw additional visitors. Critics say it's become exactly what they feared: a luxury event venue that happens to be housed in a medieval castle. Walk through on a summer weekend, and you might encounter a wedding photo shoot on the Gloriette, a corporate team-building exercise in the maze, a classical concert on the lawn, gift shops selling branded merchandise, cafes serving cream teas to tourists. The atmosphere is polished, commercial, professional. It feels less like a historic house and more like a well-run tourist attraction. Supporters say this is survival. Without revenue from events, the foundation couldn't afford the conservation work. The annual maintenance budget is £4 to £5 million. That covers routine repairs, staff salaries, utilities, insurance, marketing, and the endless small tasks required to keep a 900-year-old building functioning, replacing roof tiles, repointing stone, treating woodworm, cleaning gutters, servicing heating systems, monitoring humidity, conserving textiles, restoring paintings. The alternative would be public ownership, and public budgets are tighter now than in 1974. The National Trust faces its own financial struggles, criticized for high admission fees, corporate sponsorships, and overdevelopment. English Heritage, the government body managing historic sites, has been forced to commercialize, hosting weddings, concerts, and events to supplement shrinking public funding. If Leeds Castle were publicly owned, it would face the same pressures, the same compromises, the same accusations of commercialization. The debate hasn't ended. In 2019, a heritage campaign group called Castles for the Nation renewed calls for Leeds to be brought under national trust or English heritage control. They argue that private foundations lack transparency, that governance is opaque, that the public has no voice in how the castle is managed. They point out that the foundation's trustees are self-appointing, a closed circle replacing themselves without democratic input. The foundation responded by opening its financial records and governance structure to public scrutiny. They published annual reports showing exactly how admission fees and event revenues are spent. 60% on conservation and maintenance, 25% on staffing, 15% on operations and marketing. No profits, no dividends, no money extracted for personal gain, just preservation. They also published their governance rules. Trustees serve 5-year terms, with a maximum of 2 consecutive terms. New trustees are selected by a nominations committee based on expertise in heritage, finance, law, or museum management. Every decision is documented, every expenditure approved by the board. The foundation, they argued, is more transparent than many public institutions. But transparency isn't the same as accountability. The public can see how the foundation operates, but they can't change it. There's no mechanism for democratic input. If the public disagrees with a trustee decision, there's no appeal, no vote, no way to force change. That's what critics mean when they say private foundations are unaccountable. So what is Leeds Castle today? A treasure or a travesty? National heritage or private property? Salvation or sellout? The honest answer is all of these things at once. Leeds Castle is a medieval fortress built by English kings, saved from collapse by an American heiress, shaped by her personal taste, open to the public through a private foundation, maintained by commercial revenue, visited by 500,000 people a year, controversial since the day it was sold, and likely to remain controversial for as long as it stands. Walk through Leeds Castle today. Cross the drawbridge. Enter the courtyard. The stone is smooth, worn by centuries of feet. The towers rise around you, solid, permanent, indifferent to the arguments they've inspired. Step into the gloriette. The rooms, olive decorated, are preserved exactly as she left them. French furniture, silk curtains, paintings in gilded frames. Everything is beautiful, tasteful, expensive. It looks like a home, not a museum, which is exactly what Olive intended. But it also feels staged, frozen, a performance of aristocratic life that no one actually lives. Walk the gardens. The parterres are perfect, every hedge trimmed to geometric precision, every flower bed immaculate. It's stunning. It's also artificial, a vision of nature tamed and controlled, maintained by unseen labor, gardeners who arrive before dawn and work until dusk to keep everything flawless. Listen to the tour guide. They'll tell you about Edward Biz and Eleanor of Castile. They'll mention Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. They'll point out the fine furniture, the rare porcelain, the impressionist paintings. They'll talk about Olive Bailey, the American heiress who saved the castle. It's a good story, well told, informative, and engaging. But listen for what's not said. The guide won't mention the servants who maintained the castle, the men and women who work 12-hour days for modest wages, whose names are recorded in account books but rarely spoken aloud. They won't talk about the political calculations behind royal ownership, the way Leeds Castle was used as a pawn in dynastic struggles, a prison for inconvenient queens, a stage for power plays. They won't discuss the controversy over Olive's foundation, the debate about whether private ownership of national heritage is acceptable. The omissions aren't deceptive. They're practical. Tours are 90 minutes long. You can't cover 900 years of history in detail. Choices must be made, but the choices reveal priorities. Leeds Castle presents itself as a love story, kings and queens, beauty and romance, a fairy tale made stone. The darker, more complicated truths are available if you dig into archives and academic histories, but they're not part of the mainstream narrative. That's true of almost every historic house. The public version is simplified, sanitized, made palatable. The full story, with all its moral complexity, uncomfortable truths, and unresolved questions, is left to specialists and scholars. Most visitors don't want complicated. They want beautiful, they want inspiring, they want to feel good about the past, not troubled by it. But some visitors do want the full story. Some want to understand not just what happened, but why, what it meant, what it cost, who paid the price. For them, the official tour is frustrating, a glossy surface that hides deeper questions. So here are the questions the tour doesn't ask. Who built Leeds Castle? Not the kings who commissioned it, but the masons, carpenters, laborers who quarried the stone, hauled it to the site, cut and shaped, and lifted it into place. What were their lives like? How were they paid? Did they have a choice? What happened to them when the work was done? Who maintained it? For 900 years, someone cleaned those floors, lit those fires, cooked those meals, washed those linens. Servants, dozens of them, working dawn to dusk, often living in cramped quarters below stairs, paid a fraction of what the art on the walls was worth. Where are their stories? Who profited, not just financially, but socially, politically? Who gained power from owning Leeds Castle? What deals were made in those rooms? What alliances formed? What betrayals? Who suffered? Anne Boleyn, certainly. Joan of Navarre, imprisoned for 3 years on false charges. The soldiers who died besieging it during the Civil War. The tenants evicted when estates changed hands. The families disrupted when the castle shifted from public to private ownership. These aren't abstract questions. They're about real people, lives shaped by decisions made in this building. History isn't just dates and architecture. It's human experience, joy and suffering, hope and fear, all layered into the stones. The ghost stories, dismissed by skeptics as superstition, might be the most honest part of Leeds Castle's history. Whether or not Anne Boleyn's spirit walks the gloriette, the idea that the past is still present, that history isn't safely sealed away, but continues to shape the present, is true. The decisions made here by kings and queens, by owners and servants, by Olive Bailey and the foundation trustees, echo forward. They shape who visits, how they experience the castle, what they learn, what they don't. Stand in the castle's chapel. It's small, intimate, beautiful. Stained glass filters colored light. The silence is profound. This is where Olive's funeral was held. This is where couples marry now, 150 weddings a year. Strangers making vows in a space soaked in history they barely understand. Is that wrong? Is it disrespectful to turn a medieval chapel into a wedding venue? Or is it exactly right, keeping the space alive, used, meaningful? If the chapel were roped off, preserved as a museum artifact, would that be better? Or would it be death, turning a living space into a dead display? There's no clear answer. Preservation always involves choices, and every choice has costs. Ropes preserve fabric, but block connection. Restoration saves structures, but erases original surfaces. Public access educates millions, but damages what it seeks to preserve. Private ownership can save what public funding won't, but it removes democratic accountability. Leeds Castle survived because Olive Bailey loved it enough to spend a fortune preserving it. Without her, it would likely have been demolished in the 1930s or 1940s, like hundreds of other British country houses. The National Trust and the government weren't stepping in. Private buyers weren't interested. Olive was the only option. But Olive's solution, the private foundation, created a precedent that still divides opinion. Should heritage be preserved by private wealth when public money isn't available? Or does privatization, even benevolent privatization, turn history into property, locking the past away from the people it belongs to? The foundation argues that Leeds Castle is more accessible now than it was under any previous owner. Before Olive, the castle was closed to the public, except for occasional tours. Under the foundation, it's open 330 days a year, visited by over 500,000 people annually. Yes, there's an admission fee, but that fee funds preservation. Without it, the castle would decay. Critics counter that £35 admission is exclusionary, that working-class families can't afford it, that heritage is being sold to those who can pay, while others are priced out. They point out that public museums like the British Museum and National Gallery are free, funded by taxes, accessible to everyone. Why should a medieval castle be different? The foundation responds that free admission sounds ideal, but isn't practical. Museums receive government grants, lottery funding, donations. Leeds Castle receives none of that. The foundation is self-funded, reliant entirely on earned income. Eliminating admission fees would require an endowment of £80 to £100 million to generate enough investment income to cover costs. That endowment doesn't exist. The debate circles back to the same fundamental question. Who should pay for preserving heritage? Should it be taxpayers, through government funding, wealthy individuals, through donations and endowments, or visitors, through admission fees? Each model has advantages and disadvantages. Each involves trade-offs. Government funding guarantees public access and democratic accountability, but it's vulnerable to budget cuts and political priorities. Private philanthropy can preserve what public funding won't, but it gives donors control and reflects their biases. User fees align costs with benefits, making visitors pay for what they use, but they exclude those who can't afford it. Leeds Castle operates under the third model, user fees plus event revenue. It works financially. The castle is preserved, maintained to high standards, accessible to hundreds of thousands of people, but it also feels transactional, commercial, less like heritage, and more like entertainment. Is that acceptable, necessary, tragic, or simply the best we can do in a world where public resources are limited and preservation is expensive? Stand at the edge of the moat and look back one more time. The castle rises from the water, towers reflected perfectly, swans gliding past. It's a postcard view, iconic, beautiful, the image printed on 1,000 brochures and postcards. But behind the beauty, the complexity remains. Leeds Castle is a palimpsest, layers of history written, erased, overwritten. Saxon manor, Norman fortress, royal palace, Tudor showpiece, private estate. American heiress's dream. Foundation managed heritage site. Each layer is real. Each left its mark. What does Leeds Castle teach us? Not lessons we'd like to hear, necessarily. Not simple morals about good and evil, right and wrong. The lessons are more uncomfortable, more ambiguous. It teaches us that preservation is expensive. Beauty requires money, constant money. Money that most people don't have, and most governments won't spend. Without wealth, whether public or private, heritage decays and disappears. It teaches us that private and public both fail. The Crown abandoned Leeds in 1552, selling it to raise cash. Private owners struggled for 400 years, barely maintaining it. The government refused to buy it in 1926. The National Trust didn't want it. Private wealth saved it, but private control bothers people. There's no perfect solution. It teaches us that history is contested. Every generation reimagines the past, reshapes it, uses it for their own purposes. Leeds Castle has been a fortress, a prison, a palace, a tourist attraction. Each version was real to the people who lived it. Each version excluded others. It teaches us that ghosts are real, not necessarily supernatural spirits, but the persistent presence of the past in the present. Anne Boleyn's story haunts Leeds Castle because her story haunts England. The questions she raises about power, gender, betrayal, justice haven't been resolved. They're still with us. Her ghost is our unfinished business, and it teaches us that beauty and injustice can coexist. Leeds Castle is breathtakingly beautiful. It's also a monument to inequality, to the concentration of wealth, to systems where some people own palaces, while others scrub floors. Both truths are real. Admiring the beauty doesn't erase the injustice. Naming the injustice doesn't destroy the beauty. What do we do with that complexity? We could ignore it. Focus only on the pretty surfaces, the fairy tale version. That's easier, more pleasant, less confronting. Or we could sit with it, accept that history is messy, that preservation is expensive, that perfect solutions don't exist, that we're always making compromises, and then ask ourselves, what compromises are we willing to make? What are we willing to pay? What are we willing to sacrifice? What do we owe the past? What do we owe each other? Leeds Castle can't answer those questions for us, but it can make them impossible to ignore. The castle stands on its island, surrounded by water, beautiful and controversial, saved and contested, 9 centuries old, and still not resolved. The sun drops below the horizon. The castle lights flicker on, warm against the deepening blue. The moat darkens. The swans settle. Another day ends. Another begins tomorrow. Visitors will arrive. Tours will be given. Stories will be told. The castle will endure, exactly as Olive intended, preserved for a future she could imagine, but never control. That's the final lesson. We build for permanence, but we can't guarantee it. We save what we love, but we can't control how future generations will understand it, value it, or use it. All we can do is make our choices, accept their limitations, and hope that what we preserve matters to someone, somewhere, someday. Leeds Castle will outlive us all. The foundation, the controversies, the debates, they're just one more layer in centuries of change. The stone endures, the water reflects, and somewhere, perhaps, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the castle is empty and still, the past is present, whispering its complicated truths to anyone willing to listen. If you enjoyed this investigation into Leeds Castle and the controversy that still surrounds it, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Tell me in the comments, should historic castles be publicly or privately owned? Should admission be free, or can fees be justified? Which castle should we explore next? Windsor, Warwick, Arundel, or perhaps one you've never heard of, a forgotten fortress with a story waiting to be told. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next story.